Welcome everybody to this evening's Sherrard conversation. The old hands among you will be familiar with the concept of a Sherrard conversation. We try to find topics which have a definitive legal content, but which are of wider interest, so anybody who isn't a lawyer would still benefit from listening in. This evening's topic about teaching advocacy in apartheid and post-apartheid South Africa combines a whole lot of things which are dear to my heart. One is advocacy teaching, because obviously that's our job. It's also about the rule of law, and perhaps most importantly, from my sentimental point of view this evening, is that it celebrates a friendship between our two institutions, the University of North Carolina and the Middle Temple. Some of you may know that we've had a close friendship and ever closer friendship for a number of years now. Master Wilmot-Smith, who is one of the speakers this evening, even though he'd asked me not to mention his name, is an alumnus of the University of North Carolina, and Master Kenneth Broun is a former dean of the law school at that university. And over the years, we've become, as I say, very close friends. So this evening marks one of the events which marks the benefits of that friendship. And this is all I'm going to say. Master Wilmot-Smith, Master Broun, thank you very much for offering this evening, or in your case, Master Broun, this afternoon. And I look forward to the session. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Krista. Thank you, right, Chris, as well. Master Kenneth Broun, I first met 10 or 15 years ago, right at the beginning of the relationship between the University of North Carolina and the Middle Temple. One of its manifestations is the mooting competition, which takes place annually. I fear this year it'll have to be virtually, but every year either they come to us or we go to them and we moot. The University of North Carolina is the upper South, I think, and Master Kenneth Broun was Dean of the Law School for quite a while, I think, 8 years, something like that. He also has a political career and was mayor of Chapel Hill. He's author of several books. The Boring Geek one is the textbook on civil procedure in the United States. So if you practice in the United States, or you know anybody who practices in the United States, they will have on their desk his textbook, which is good because it must be a good pension. But he is also author of 2 books, which we are going to discuss as part of the Sherrard conversation. But before we get to South Africa, first of all, I'd like Ken, could you please tell us what the National Institute of Trial Advocacy, or NITA, is? Because that's going to, that's the base of our, or from which our discussion is going to take off.
First, thanks, Richard, and it's a pleasure to be here. And I feel this is my English home for sure, and one of my real honors in life to be associated with Middle Temple. NITA, or the National Institute for Trial Advocacy, began in the early 1970s. Prior to that time, there was very, very little advocacy teaching, either in the American law schools or among the practicing bar. And as all of you know, the bar is open to both office lawyers and to litigators in the U.S., but very little advocacy training. The sessions that were held were generally lecture sessions in which the lawyers will tell people how they won the great cases of that time. NITA was an attempt to look seriously at the training of trial lawyers. And the idea was to train through participation, to create problems, to create mini trials, to create cross-examination and direct examination problems, arguments to the court, jury selection is far more a part of our system, particularly in criminal cases, than it is yours. And arguments to the court, opening statements, and so on. To give the students an opportunity. Students, it started with young practicing lawyers, and we did programs in Boulder, Colorado, later throughout the United States, and then eventually throughout the law schools in the country. The NITA method is now the generally prescribed method for teaching advocacy around the country. But it's based literally upon learning by doing. It has been quite successful, and NITA still exists and still puts on programs. All law schools have a NITA type course. There are some competing producers of materials, but the methodology is still the same. I think it's evolved favorably over the years. I think we spend much more time dealing with the hard theoretical work than we did at first. I think it was too heavily on the theatrics at the beginning and too little on substance. But I think it's now evened out, and the emphasis of substance is quite strong. I was involved in not the initial trial session, but the first full session, which was 1973. I was a very, very young man at that time.
Oh, no, you were almost a child. Right. The method is interesting because for students will now be becoming aware of what we call the method here. It's called in England the Hempel method, basically because it was stolen by an Australian professor. Somebody once asked you at Cumberland Lodge whether you'd read any of the course materials on the Hempel method, and what was your response, Ken?
Modestly, actually, I wrote them. He borrowed our materials and seemed to pass them off without attribution, something which has been a thorn in Nita's side. I've had contact with him for many years, but I do remember seeing that material and noticing it as being quite familiar to me. What he borrowed, of course, was the methodology, and I think he carried it out as we have. There are other organizations within the U.S. and other places that do similar kinds of teaching and borrow the NITA method. No other program claims it as their own, however.
What would you say that the NITA method or the method is? What does it aim to teach in a sentence?
Yes, what it aims to do is to teach through the students attempting to deal with the problems themselves. There's some lecture, there's some written materials, but attempting to deal with the problem themselves. And from the beginning, we made great use of videotape, of video of the student performance. And the best teaching of all is to have the students see themselves on tape. It's a terrifying experience for them and for anybody who's been through it. But it is quite useful. And to put the performance in the context, particularly under the more advanced NITA method, to put it in the context of the actual trial. Simply to do an examination in chief or a cross-examination in the abstract doesn't mean much, obviously. What it means, of course, is where this fits in the trial and how it fits to your whole trial theory, and that's what we're doing. It is not an easy thing to teach. The NITA trainers are generally well skilled in bringing out from the students the right answer rather than lecturing to them. This is how I would have examined this witness. getting them to do it by themselves, I think, is the essence of the NEDA method. As I've seen out at Cumberland Lodge, it's the essence of the system that you're using as well.
Well, I've certainly, well, I've sat in on a class run by Krista's husband, Bernard, who is a star teacher.
Yes, he is indeed. Yeah.
And really demonstrates the method. But I dare say all of you will, in some way or another, come across some advocacy teachers in Middle Temple and the method. Now we're now going to transport from the 1970s, when Ken was a young man, to when he was slightly, but not much older, and South Africa. Now, how did you get to go to South Africa, Ken?
Well, it was strange. My son, who was a high school student at the time, was one of the last classes of what we call American Field Service, that is sending high school students abroad places. One of the last groups to actually go to South Africa. And he was there in 1985. And a colleague of mine at North Carolina was overlooking at the plight of Black lawyers in the country. And she met a great gentleman by the name of Godfrey Piche, who was at that point the director of the Black Lawyers Association Legal Education Center. There were only about 100 Black lawyers out of a bar of well over 6,000 in South Africa, but there was an attempt to try to provide education. And Lucy White, who was my colleague, asked him, what do the Black lawyers in South Africa need? And Godfrey replied immediately, they need advocacy teaching. They need to know how to behave in the courtroom. They don't have any mentors. White lawyers have mentors. They have people whose briefcases they are carrying. They watch people in court. We don't have any of that. There is no law school that's providing training. That was true in the US as well, but not to have any mentoring, not to be able to be exposed to it was really important. So Lucy came back. I was dean of the law school at the time. She waltzed into my office and she says, well, you're going to South Africa. You're an experienced advocacy teacher, and I'm sending you and her husband was a partner in a great law firm, civil rights law firm run by the Julius Chambers, who was an outstanding African-American lawyer. And his chief litigator was a fellow named Jim Ferguson, or Fergie. Fergie, one of the great advocates in the US in civil rights cases and in a number of cases, criminal cases, personal injury cases, great lawyer, and also a NEDA teacher. And Fergie's African-American, and of course I'm white. And he says, the two of you will be a great team. You're going to South Africa. And we said, well, we don't know anything about South African law. And Lucy says, don't worry about it. You'll figure it out. So we applied. She got us some money through an agency involved with the Ford Foundation in the U.S. Got us our transportation, and the Black Lawyers Association would be setting it up. And we did a prototype program. We had a little bit of trouble getting the visa. The apartheid government didn't know what we were doing. What was this, particularly this Black lawyer coming over there? But we went and we did a prototype program, and we involved some of the really fine civil rights lawyers, both Black and white, in the country to help us to make sure we weren't wandering astray with regard to procedure, and found that the methodology worked very well. There was, by that time, no jury trial in South Africa, but the methodology, the problems, the procedure was sufficiently close to both the English and the American that we could provide some help. Examination in chief was the same, cross-examination was the same, and arguments to the court. I must say that while I had some involvement and take some of the credit for the preparation of materials for the methodology, it was Fergie, who, as a great Black lawyer himself, setting this scene, doing demonstrations of examination and cross-examination and argument to the court that I think made a terrific difference for these people. He became just an outstanding role model. Very often I learned, I can't do it anymore, but I could do the accent of an Afrikaner cop. And I very often played the witness and let Fergie, I didn't have to let Fergie destroy me. He would destroy me much to the delight of the audiences. And we did this, and it worked sufficiently that we went back and began to bring over other NITA teachers, other lawyers. High percentage were African-American lawyers. Fergie's law partner, Geraldine Sumter, became very involved in the program. Great lawyer, great trial lawyer herself. A number, Rudy Pierce, who was on the NITA board and was a judge in Boston, came over, also African-American, but a few white lawyers came over. And we carried it through, and we were over in South Africa every year. I went, I think, every year for 25 years. I've been back some since, but not as regularly as I was. We carried it through the end of apartheid to the present day.
Well, speaking of the end of apartheid, most people think of as being Nelson Mandela, the famous time of him coming out of jail. I'm just going to hold up to the camera a book called Black Lawyers, White Courts. Nelson Mandela wrote an introduction to it, and I'm just going to read from that. And it's not many people have an introduction to their book by Nelson Mandela, is it? I mean, how many of you know? I don't know.
I was quite proud.
Anyway, what he says is, he talks about the lawyers, and we're going to come to the lawyers. I've got 2 or 3 to introduce to you, but he comes to the lawyers, and he says, they've experienced oppression firsthand and know the joys of freedom. They know the role that law can play to accomplish wrong, as under apartheid, and they also know what good it can accomplish in a free society. These men and women are the heroes of yesterday and the hope of tomorrow. I salute them, and their history is set forth in this book. So them are the people who Nelson Mandela, or President Mandela, as he wrote that, were saluting, were the people that Ken has taught. Now you mentioned Fergie.
We're taught with, yeah. We're taught with.
And some of the people that I just wonder if you could, if we could talk about, for example, Ismail Muhammad.
Ismail Muhammad was a great lawyer and a great man. He, unlike most of the people with whom we worked, who were in using the apartheid classifications, most of the people were Black, the largest group of Black people. Ismail Muhammad was of Indian descent, which was a separate classification. And he had a few more privileges, not many, but a few more privileges. One of the privileges that he had, though, was that he was more readily admitted to one of the major universities. And in fact, he went and studied law at the University of the Witwatersrand, which is a great university in Johannesburg, and studied law there. He was one of few people of color, I guess I would use that term, there. He graduated and went into the bar. The most interesting thing was that while he could be admitted as a barrister, called advocates in South Africa, he could be admitted as an advocate, but because he was not of white or European stock, he could not have an office in the central business district, which is where all the people had, all the barristers, all the advocates had offices. So what he did, he found a group of friendly advocates who would let him literally be a squatter. And for 12 years in his practice, beginning in the early 50s, mid 50s, he would come into the office every day and find an empty office. If a lawyer was on trial or out of Johannesburg, he would go and he would sit in that office and he would deal with his clients at that point. Of course, he couldn't go to a restaurant in town. He couldn't go to the club room where the lawyers ate. So he would often have his lunch in the men's room, which he was permitted to go in. And that went on for 12 years until he was oddly named senior counsel, the equivalent of your Queen's counsel. He was named senior counsel. He had developed such a reputation himself, developed and became senior counsel. At which point they came and said, well, we'll be able to now give you an office, and we've arranged it for you to have an office, but you still can't come into the club room to have lunch. And they finally one day a lawyer knocked on his door and said, Ishmael, we're really sorry for the way that you've been treated. He says, but I want to ask you something, and you've got to promise not to use the F word in responding to what I have to say. But would you join us in the club room? And he said what he wanted to say was the F word back there. But in fact, he joined that and came on. He became, he had turned down a judgeship even in the waning days of apartheid until apartheid was finally finished. When it was finally finished, he became a trial court judge and then joined the Constitutional Court and was the first Chief Justice of South Africa under Nelson Mandela. And he was a brilliant advocate. I actually heard him argue a case in a labor case during apartheid, and he was magnificent. He was magnificent.
What would you say was the big takeaway that you had from watching him?
I think that in Ishmael Muhammad's case, it was intellect and skill in the use of the English language and thorough preparation. I mean, this was a worker, which is what I always try to emphasize to my advocacy students. It's not simply being articulate. It's not simply being persuasive. It's the work that you put in to develop your theory of the case and to have the case that I heard him argue was an appellate case, and he had an encyclopedic knowledge of the cases in law, and that was Ishmael Muhammad. I don't think that he would be a courtroom. Notice that F. Lee Bailey just died. He wouldn't be an F. Lee Bailey, but he was just thoroughly prepared and thoroughly skilled and wonderfully intellectual in his operation.
We'll have one more before we move on to more general discussion of the arc. We're going to ask about the arc of origins, childhood, education, and careers of them. But let's look at Ditgang Maseneki.
Ditgang Maseneki, one of the great. I think this is one of the great and illustrative life stories of any of the lawyers that I work with. Ditgang Maseneki at age 15 was attending one of the few remaining church school. It was a Methodist school up near Pretoria. And he, together with his headmaster and others, were charged with violation of the South African law by making anti-government statements. And they were tried in the court. They could not find an advocate to represent them. Ditkang wound up representing himself in it, which I think caused him to get a longer sentence. The judge, in sentencing him, said, "I've seen you cross-examine. You're obviously very bright and you knew what you were doing. Therefore, I'm giving the others 5 years. You, I give 10 years." And he gave him 10 years. And he went to Robben Island. Well, on Robben Island, he first was subject to some brutality, but that eased off, frankly. And he was eventually permitted, while he was still on Robben Island, and was there for 10 years. But he was able to do finish high school by correspondence, to begin his law studies by correspondence. When he was released, he was subject to a banning order. When he was out of the jail, but still could not associate with other people, which means he couldn't go to classes. So he finished his law work, including his LLB, which permitted him to be an advocate, a barrister, by correspondence, and finished by correspondence, and began practice law first as an attorney or solicitor, and then as an advocate. When he took the bar exam, South Africa actually ranked people in the bar exam. He finished first in the country in his bar exam. And I said, "Ditkang, that's absolutely amazing." He says, "Why? I didn't have anything else to do." I had nothing else to do but to study. Well, he went on to a very successful career, was perhaps the most successful black lawyers. When Mandela was coming in, he was his appointee to head the election commission in the 94 election. He was then one of the drafters of the new Constitution. He went on the bench shortly, left, went into business for a short time, and then eventually went back to practice, but went on the court, and he's recently retired as the deputy president of the Constitutional Court. He would have become president of the Constitutional Court. He and Jacob Zuma never got along, or at least didn't get along in the later years, and that was an impediment to him. But an amazing, absolutely amazing mind. And he both was a brilliant scholar of the law and extremely well prepared, but he also was a brilliant courtroom performer. Really able to spellbind the court, and I think was very important. He's still quite active.
What would you say, so far as a courtroom lawyer, would be his big strength that you would point out?
Well, I think that in one of the things that separated both Ismail Muhammad and Ditkang Maseneke from some of the young lawyers that we worked with is both of them were and are extremely articulate in the use of the English language. In Ishmael's case, it was at least an equal native tongue for him. Ditkang, I think, is Setswana speaking to begin with, but developed great skill in the use of the English language. One of the things that Ditkang emphasized in all of the talking that I did with him is something interesting about the South Africans, particularly the apartheid government and that whole structure. He figured out relatively early in his career that as evil as the law was, the apartheid law was, the South African government and courts would follow what was written. and they would follow it literally without much imagination. And if you figured out some flaw in the way that it was written, you could be quite successful in cases. And it was truly remarkable the way in which he would find some obscure South African law that would permit his criminal clients to get bail, which was absolutely unheard of. That would permit appeals from things that nobody thought there was an appeal from, because he was able to say, well, this is what your law says. You've got to follow it. And the South African court said, yes, we do. Now, they may change the law the next week, but by that time they would go on. And when you think about rule of law in a limited sense, that's what he was able to figure out more than any other lawyer of that era. So it was his ability to deal with the language of the courtroom, which was essentially English, and he could speak Afrikaans quite fluently as well. But his ability to understand what made the courts tick, what made the judges tick, what made the South African government tick, and came on. His opinions then in the Constitutional Court under the new South Africa were some great examples of judicial reason using law which was better and usable for good.
Marvelous. Now we're just going to have, I'm going to ask you about one thing about the LLB1 and the LLB2 before we move on to that great litigant in person, Nelson Mandela himself.
Well, this was just simply an attempt on the part of the educational system. One of the things that became apparent to me in my time in South Africa was my initial mistake of totally equating apartheid with what I knew of segregation in the American South. Both were evil and both had lots in common. I'm not saying that, but apartheid went a step beyond. There was no pretense of separate but equal, which was the pretense of education in the American South and elsewhere. There was a Bantu education law, which basically said that no Black was able to be educated beyond the level of a domestic servant. That was the articulated parliamentary policy. And now some Blacks were able to overcome that, particularly in the later years of apartheid. I'm thinking about the mid to late 80s. But there was an attempt on that part to say, well, we don't think the Blacks are capable of dealing with law the same way that the whites are. Therefore, we're going to create two classes of LLB. One, the LLB for white lawyers, and the other is the LLB for Black lawyers. It was so typical of the apartheid measures and the laws of apartheid. I mean, this is a country that dictated by law what meals were served to what racial groups in prison. Blacks were not permitted by law to have any meat when they were in prison, whereas white prisoners did, and Indian prisoners could have them occasionally. I mean, that was it. So this was part of the scheme.
Now we're going to move on because to the Rivonia Trial. Again, plugging another book this is by Ken again. It's called Saving Nelson Mandela, OUP. And it's all about the Rivonia Trial, and Nelson Mandela was, of course, the defendant. And it was as a result of this trial, wasn't it, that he was sent to Robben Island. What was the Rivonia trial about in a paragraph, not a
The
sentence?
trial was actually a trial of, there were 10 Rivonia defendants. Actually, 2 of them escaped, but that's another story. But there were 8 of them that actually went on trial. They were charged with what the government referred to as sabotage, what the Sabotage Act was. And it was very similar to treason, and also carried the death penalty, but it was very specific. Sabotage was to take an act done for the purpose of overthrowing the government, to take a violent act and take an act toward the overthrowing of the government. It had a strange provision which was unique to South African law, and indeed unique, as far as I know, to any Anglo-American jurisdiction. And that is, once the government proved the commission of the act, there was a presumption, and therefore the burden of proof switching to defendant to prove that it was not done for the purposes of overthrowing the government. In other words, the burden shifted to the defendant. Entirely, not only contrary to the American Constitution and the English practice, but contrary to South African practice. This was a unique law, and that's what they were faced with. Now, the truth is that these people were, in fact, planning the overthrow of the government. They were, in fact, storing explosive. They were, in fact, involved in acts of sabotage, although, as was important in the trial, there was no proof that any person had, in fact, been injured by reason of their acts. They blew up railroad tracks. They blew up storage facilities, but there was no harm to human beings, and none was proven. The question was, how do you defend this? There really was no defense. They had caught, Mandela actually was not caught in the raid that yielded most of the defendant. It was a raid on a farm where they had been plotting things. Actually, Nelson Mandela had been at that farm at one point, disguised as the gardener, David Musayai. And but he was in prison at the time. He was on Robben Island, but he was brought back when the others were charged to stand trial with them. And there were documents which were certainly incriminating, not only of them, but of Mandela personally, things that he wrote. So this was a difficult legal case. One of the issues, of course, in any criminal trial was whether the defendants would take the stand. And some of the defendants did take the stand. Walter Sisulu, who was probably as much of a leader of the ANC as Mandela, Govan Mbeki, and others were going to take the stand and subject themselves to cross-examination. Mandela and his lawyers, led by the brilliant Bram Fischer, who was a great criminal defense lawyer and Afrikaner by birth, and others, Arthur Chaskelson, George Bezos, great lawyers. With Mandela, they made the decision that Mandela would not take the stand, but rather would make a statement from the dock. And at the beginning of the defense case, when it was very clear that the state had proved enough to find these guys guilty and sentence them to death, his lawyer, Bram Fischer, told the court that he would make the statement to the court. And he did. The prosecutor, who was a piece of work, said, well, doesn't he know that it's not evidence in the case? And the judge, in one of his rare moments of humor, said, I think that Mr. Mandela and his lawyers understand what's going on in this courtroom. And so Mandela got up and gave a statement which lasted 4.5 hours. And in it, he went through the history of the ANC, the history of the anti-government movement, the reason why he believed that the government had left them no choice but this terrorism or this sabotage, and they had not yet engaged in acts of terrorism. In it, he admitted enough to hang himself. That's clear. And he made the statement, and I think by that point sealed his conviction, but in my judgment saved his life. I think both he and the others who testified, I think, while admitting the acts, humanized themselves instead of the objectification that had been going on. They were people who had a human aspect to them. And I think they sold the judge on that. And while he was willing to put them in jail for the rest of his life, I believe that that was a reason for him not to be a part of that. I was just thinking whether it the most famous statement. Can I read the?
Yeah, do please. I was about to ask you that. Please, yes.
Pardon me. Let me put my glasses on to do this. These words, incidentally, are now enshrined on the walls of the relatively new Constitutional Court, the court that was created to give South Africa a constitutional government. These are his last paragraph of his speech. During my lifetime, I have dedicated myself to this struggle of the African people. I have fought against white domination and I have fought against black domination. I have cherished the idea of a democratic and free society in which all persons live together in harmony and with equal opportunities. It is an ideal which I hope to live for and see realized. But if needs be, it is an ideal for which I am prepared to die. Interestingly, the phrase, if needs be, he didn't have that in his initial draft of the speech. His young at that time, George Bezos, his young lawyer, said, gee, don't invite the judge to kill you. Just give him an out, and said, if needs be, and that was his only modification of that speech. But those words, it is very moving to go to the Constitutional Court and see that last paragraph on the wall of the court. If you get to Johannesburg, that's well done. Yeah.
And 3 words, if needs be, debated for hours, presumably.
That's right. Oh, they were, I'm sure.
Which I suppose, so far as just coming full circle on advocacy, sometimes that kind of thing does, that kind of decision does take time.
Yes.
But it's amazing and monumental. Well, I think there were other things I got in my talking points, Ken, but we've, I think, come to the end of the time set aside for our chat.
Not too long, sorry.
Oh, no, it's not you, it's me. It's been fantastic. Thank you so much. But now I'm going to sort of bow out, and we're going to take questions from students, and Chris Bates is going to be the moderator. So Chris, over to you to be the Jackie Weaver of this conversation.
Thank you very much, Master Wilmot-Smith. I can assure everyone that I do in fact have the authority to moderate this discussion. And thank you very much, Master Broun, for those frankly very interesting and fascinating perspectives. Does anyone have a question that they want to start off with? If you do, could you please use the hand up function? It's in reactions. If you on the bottom of your screen, usually if you go reaction, raise hand. If you have a question, please use that, and it will ping up on my screen. Equally, if you are feeling a little shy, you can type it into the chat box and I can read it out for you. Does anyone have anything that they want to start with? Nobody's pinging immediately. I might be going too fast for people to give them a chance to write. But I had a question that I thought I would ask to sort of start us off. Given the current sort of climate that we have, I mean, we're a year on from the death of George Floyd and the Black Lives Matter movement essentially really coming to the forefront, I think, of everybody's mind, both in the USA and the UK. Is there anything, Master Broun, from your experience in working in South Africa at that time and the way that things essentially changed, is there anything that we can learn from the past, from what happened there, that we could apply to now?
I think that the lesson that I hope I learned in working with the Black lawyers, and I hope I didn't violate it too often, was to listen to the people who have been the object of oppression. That it starts and literally ends with them, and that our own ideas of right and wrong are not nearly as important and maybe distorted, that it is the people who have been oppressed, the not just the George Floyds of the world, but others who have been in that situation, and the Black South Africans during apartheid, to listen to them. I thought that was something that Fergie, my partner in crime in this instance, did extremely well. Fergie had been a very active civil rights lawyer in the U.S. He had been responsible for the case desegregating the Charlotte, North Carolina schools, an amazingly important piece of litigation that went all the way up to the U.S. Supreme Court. But Fergie never, ever told the Black lawyers we were working with in South Africa how to run their revolution. He would respond and give responses to them. And I think that's something that all of us interested in civil rights need to understand. It is the oppressed people that need to be running the show, need to be saying, what is it that they need, not what you think they need. And I think that's part of it. And it's Fergie's example as much as it is mine. One of the other things, and it's a similar contact. One of the things I realized very quickly in South Africa during apartheid is when I was traveling with my Black friends in South Africa, I was subject to the same restrictions as they were. We had the same hotels, we had the same limitation to restaurants, except one day I realized, my God, all I have to do is walk out of the hotel and I'm a privileged person. My skin gives me privilege. I'm going to be treated differently than, and that's a recognition that's really significant. And it took me a while to appreciate what was different. And as much as I may sympathize, as much as I might understand what's going on, I ain't subject to it. And that, I think, is important.
I don't know if anyone else has got another question, but there's something that you said just a few moments ago in relation to Fergie. Now, as a criminal pupil, I had to defend, and I particularly did a lot of sentencing exercises, or a lot of trials as well, for young Black men in the City of London. And without getting into a full-blown advocacy lesson, we don't have time for that, and that's not what we're here for. But is there anything that you could give to people such as myself in that kind of situation, where as a white man, I'm sat there with a young Black man who I've got completely different walk of life, completely different experience?
Have you frozen, or?
Looks like he's frozen, but you get the gist, Ken.
Yeah, I'm trying to, what might I have in terms of advice? Well, I think that somehow the very, very difficult task is to try to put the judge, the trier, the decider, in the words of our former President Bush, the decider in the shoes of this human being. And I think that part of what I was saying in connection with Nelson Mandela in the Rivonia trial was humanizing them, understanding where they come from, somehow letting the judge understand that this is a human being. I think that the objectification of people, particularly in the criminal justice system, both in my country and yours, goes on, and it's very difficult to do. My son is a lawyer who does nothing but death penalty work. He does capital cases. He's probably tried more capital cases than anybody certainly in North Carolina. And he spends most of his time dealing with what we call mitigation, dealing with the history of this human being. How did this human being get to be where he, and in some instances she, are now, and trying to convince, in his cases, the jury, but in some cases the judge, trying to convince them that they really are a human being who deserve to live. And it's the humanization of it rather than simply the word. One of the death penalty lawyers uses the term changing the picture from the brutal criminal to the human being, as bad as the crime is. And some of the crimes my son deals with are absolutely horrendous. But dealing with the person as a human being, recognizing that as bad as they may have acted, they're still a human being. And I think that that's part of any sentencing hearing.
Thank you. That's a really, I think, quite useful and quite practical tip, actually, that you could probably quite easily incorporate into the sort of work that I've been doing. I do have a question here on the chat from Deep Tea. And here we go. How important do you think that it's to have freedom expression in the cultural language of the oppressed person, and therefore for the imperfect system to bend to understanding and facilitating that in the pursuit of justice?
I'm trying to understand the questions.
So I've read it a couple of times, and I was hoping that in reading it out, I might understand it a little bit better. Cultural language.
Is it part of the same thing I've been talking about in terms of humanizing, understanding the culture that people come from?
So
that certainly could be part of it. That you've got to understand the culture and understand that it's different and different from that which the judge has experienced in his or her life. Yeah.
Deepti sent me a clarification. Essentially, the distinctions in cultural and verbal body languages. I think I might be right. I might be right in saying that in Bangladeshi culture, for example, a handshake is something that's not typically done. So that we, as an Englishman, where you certainly used to going for a handshake, that for a Bangladeshi person might not be culturally acceptable. Things like that. So how much should the law be bending to consider that?
Well, I think that it's a whole question again of educating the judge in this instance to what the culture is, and to without speaking down to the judge, which we should never do, but to try to get him or her to understand the where this person is coming from. This comes up more specifically, and you run into it in the George Floyd kinds of cases, and we see it a lot, and I know you do as well. A lot of the times, the police view the actions of the defendant, of the accused, in the light of their culture and their history. The accused will have a different view of the police, will have a different, the tendency is distrust. The tendency, when it comes up, is the tendency is to run. And that's a real problem. That's a real problem. Why did you run away? So many of the cases that we're getting in this country, and I'm sure that in yours as well, of people shot while they're running away from the police, that's not necessarily a sign of guilt. And that's true. And education of the judge, I think that's part of what's involved. That's a specific instance that I think of, at least.
Do you think is that a policing issue? That's something that we need to be addressing through police training, or is that something that we can be addressing directly through the legal system?
I think both. I think that the police need to be aware of the differences in culture, and that's part of it. But I think that in reaction and in assessing the court's reaction to the actions of the accused at the time of arrest, in dealing with things like confessions, different reactions to the incarceration and to the impact of the confession. That's a matter for the lawyers to convince the judge of in an individual cases. So it's judicial education, it's police education, but it's also lawyering somehow to get across. And the lawyer, of course, needs, before he or she can effectively articulate the problem, need to understand it themselves. So often usually the lawyer comes from a whole different cultural background. And to understand the cultural background that he or she is dealing with is really important, right?
I mean, to take that example further, if we are in the context of a court case, potentially if you've got, say, an immigrant from a foreign jurisdiction where the police perhaps are a symbol of authority in a corrupt government, they're sort of being used to crack down on people, not really fair and independent. Perhaps there's a sort of a fear of the police. Should we, as advocates, be trying to convey that through in our work in representing to defend that person?
I think that's something that you ought to attempt to do. It may not be easy to do, but it's something that the lawyer needs to do. But before the lawyer can do that, she needs to understand it. And I think that's
I've got another question here from Ramola. Do you feel that the NETA advocacy method is appropriate when considering that one of the parties might be a litigant in person and the other is a highly trained advocate?
That's a good question. We probably get less of that in this country, although we do get what we call pro se litigation. But for the most part, it's advocate against advocate. Is the questioner talking about the recognizing the inequality of ability to argue the case, and it's appropriate to use your skills against someone who's inadequately trained? Is that the question?
That sounds right to me. Because essentially, obviously, yeah, we as barristers.
I don't know what you do in that instance. I think that in the few times in my career in which I've gone against a non-lawyer opponent, I always found it much more difficult than going up against a skilled lawyer. I like going up against a skilled lawyer because I know how the game is going to be played, and feel better about it. And I always, looking at it simply from an advocacy standpoint, I think you need to be very careful in dealing with that person and make sure that you treat that person fairly. I think for your own good, not simply to equal the playing field. I think you need to be aware of that and be aware that the playing field is unequal and that you've got advantages and that you're a skilled lawyer and conduct yourself accordingly for your own good.
Yes, I think that probably has got to be the position. I mean, it might be something that Master Wilmot-Smith could comment on further, obviously as an experienced practitioner. But for those of you who are obviously on the bar course and doing your ethics exams, you'll of course remember that in the UK, you have your duty to protect and advance the best interests of your client. But obviously, if you are dealing with a litigant in person, of course, you do have to essentially try and make sure that their case is put as well to the court to ensure that your duties to the court are satisfied.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. One way you can, there are two things to point out. One is you might want to think of yourself when you're against a litigant in person as acting what they used to call ex parte. In other words, it's just you and the court. And when that happens, you have to point out all the authorities and everything against you, because well, A, those are the rules, but B, you'll come back later into partes. And if you translate that lesson into against a litigant in person, you're going to come to an accounting. So have you treated the other side's case fairly? And one of my first experiences was to point out to a High Court judge when I was asking for an ex parte injunction that the authorities were against me and I didn't have anything anything to say to them because I had a rubbish case. And this was when the judge was just about ready to give me the injunction. Well, I never got instructions from those solicitors ever again. But I did have the eternal thanks of the judge who was about to give me what I asked for. But the accounting is important because there always is an accounting in life, and there always is going to be it in front of the judge or whatever. You may trick your inadequate opponent into getting what you want for that moment, but it never lasts. So you have to listen to what your other side says, what your litigant in person says. Filter it as if you were his advocate. And one thing you can do is to say to him and the court, what I understand Mr. So-and-so is saying is this, putting it in language which is appropriate and easily understood by everybody, not in a patronizing way, but understood by your litigant in person and understood by the judge. mirroring and reflection, so that if he nods and says, yes, that is the point, then you can deal with it. So you're articulating both sides. The danger you can have is if your opponent is difficult to understand, lots of non sequiturs and the like. And then you have to try and avoid getting impatient and dismissing what they say. Take a breath when that happens.
Thank you for that, Master Wilmot-Smith. I think that's quite a useful technique actually that many of us could actually put into practice, having to deal with that kind of situation. I've got another question on the chat here from Master Broun. Essentially, putting yourself back in time, stepping off that plane in South Africa, presumably you were on a plane, stepping off the plane for the first time. What was your first impressions?
Oh, hard to say. I had no idea what to expect. And I must say that on the surface, there was a feeling of normality. There's a feeling of society going along. We were immediately ushered into a 5-star hotel, and things were very comfortable. And I must say that it's only in joining and hearing the stories of the Black people with whom I was working that I began to understand what it was all about, and being a part of it. There had been a great deal of violence in the years that I first came there, 86, 87. It was a very difficult time, but I think in lots of places in which there's violence and strife, it doesn't affect you in your everyday work. I don't remember ever being frightened in ordinary activities, part of it. Only, and my wife was with me this time, only we went into one of the Black townships, which was under the Army's supervision, and walking down the street with our Black friends and seeing what they called Caspers. Caspers look like oil trucks, except they have rifles going out of the holes in the back, and them going by. And my wife said that she knew what it was like to have her knees shake at that point, because you realize what these people are under. So that was part of it. And again, and this is a repeat, I did not appreciate in reading about apartheid how comprehensive it was. How much it affected absolutely every aspect of one's life. There wasn't any safe place for Black people. There wasn't any safe course of action for Black people. There were not Black people who were not oppressed. There just were not, and that makes a difference.
I've been in a situation where you feel your knees quake a few times in my life. So I'd say probably twice properly. But to have that in a position where it's your own government and agents of your own government, it's right. Exactly right. But flipping that on its head, if I can, stepping off the plane when you've gotten back to the United States.
Yes.
Obviously, the States has its own difficulties, not quite the same level perhaps as South Africa, but still its own challenges with race at the time. What was the reaction? Were people supportive?
For the most part, yes, but understanding that I live in a university community with a very liberal area, you know, this is going back to before your time. I mean, you know, George McGovern carried Chapel Hill by 75%. This is 1972. So it was a very different community. But I do remember the responses of people. The most common was, why was I working with Black lawyers? Why didn't I work with all lawyers? And the answer is, of course, our programs were open to all lawyers, and we occasionally would have a white lawyer that came into one of our programs. But for the most part, the white lawyers didn't want any part of us. And that was fine. But trying to explain to people who literally said, well, it's all equal and we're race blind, and why are you just working with Black lawyers was something that I had to deal with. Yeah.
We have that now over here with White Lives Matter too. I mean, it's just, and this is 50 years ago with you.
Oh yeah, I mean, it was. I would get some of that, and I do remember I gave a talk to the group of University of North Carolina trustees, I guess, which is it was a better group then than it is now, I must say. But the one of the question was, well, isn't there some choice other than an economic boycott? Because that's what I was advocating. I was advocating a disenfranchising of any connection with South Africa and total boycott of it, which came in. And somebody asked me, says, well, isn't there another course? And I said, well, we could send weapons to the Black people in South Africa, because I think that's the only other course. That didn't get much of a good response, I must say.
I went to judges school. I was a recorder 25 years ago, and you had to go on refresher courses. And they started giving talks about race, about inequality and the like. This was under Lord Justice Brooke. It was remarkable how common the reaction was from the judges on my course as they were being taught, that they were completely colorblind, that they didn't really understand that they needed to be taught anything. And they treated everybody the same. And this is 25 years ago. Things really aren't that much different, are they?
Yeah, I think it goes back to the question that was asked just a few minutes ago, which I think is really important in the work of lawyers in dealing with clients, all clients, but the education of the judge in what the culture of that individual was and where he or she comes from, I think is really crucial to the defense, particularly at the sentencing part.
So if you can source, I mean, English students, if you can source the equal treatment bench book, which is the bench book that judges get, it's really quite enlightening. They've done very well on the teaching materials of judges, but how well some of them learn is a different question. Others, like Chris, may know better than me.
And in the context of the particular crime with what you're dealing. I mean, it's not just enough to talk about it in the abstract, but to try to tie it into the particular conduct of this individual. Again, particularly in the sentencing phase. It may not help you in guilt innocence, but in the sentencing phase, I think it really is important.
Yes, I found with sentencing that the easiest sentencing were drug offences, because the guidelines are absolutely clear. Mm-hmm. You could almost put the drugs on a weighing scale, and that would tell you how much people got. But the other ones are rather different, particularly crimes of violence and the context thereof, really very hard to judge. Well, Chris, how are we doing for questions, or are we out of time?
We're not Oh, sorry, I thought my microphone was on mute there. We've still got 10 minutes that we can use for questioning. I've not got any more questions popping up.
If you have no more questions,
I saw one down in the chat.
Oh, here we go. No, one's just popped up. Did the defendants in the Rivonia trials even accept the state had jurisdiction over them?
Yeah, I think they did. There were some later cases in the 80s in which there were treason murder trials. There's a wonderful book written about a trial in which the defendants who were part of an ANC literally assassination squad. And there's no question, not only were they involved in terrorism, but they had actually singled out some black policemen who had been oppressing people within their townships and killed them. And there was a trial, and they objected to the jurisdiction of the court, saying that they were prisoners of war. But there was nothing like that in the Rivonia case. This was still a pretty straightforward criminal trial in which there was no attempt to question the jurisdiction of the court or the right of the court to try them. But as I say, later on, it did come to that, and that's a fairly natural action. And of course, you get that in some trials today in the U.S. At least I think in the UK as well.
I have one question which takes off from an earlier reference you made to the contrast between segregation and apartheid. Segregation only really stopped in the American South in about 1965, was it, after?
Yeah, question whether it stopped even then, but
yes, but they took the signs down, I think.
Yeah, the official signs were down. Yeah.
Did you find that the legal abolition of segregation in the South changed many mindsets at all in the immediate aftermath?
Well, I think it had some impact for some people. How's that for a wishy-washy answer? I think that the greater contact among people, particularly in the schools, it didn't work all the time, and the schools were still segregated, if not officially segregated by tracking of classes and so on. But I think that the contact between and among the students had some positive impact. Similarly, the public facilities, the seeing of people of both races or all races on public accommodations and in movies and in restaurants, I think had some positive effect. I think we've gone somewhat more positively it has not ended things by any means, and it is not. There is still terrific racism and terrific segregation that exists outside the legal framework, but it's still part of it. Some of what is the cause, at least in the U.S., that continues to be two things. One is the continuing segregation of the schools, even if they are not formally segregated, with Black students not being in the same classes as white students because of tracking. But the others, particularly in the big cities of the north, and it's actually more of a northern problem than it is a southern problem, the neighborhoods. People live in different neighborhoods. They don't see each other. And there are some mixed neighborhoods, but I grew up in the city of Chicago, which is totally segregated. Never had signs up that saying Black people couldn't use the beaches, but it is a totally segregated city and continues to be a totally segregated city. And I think that's true with all of the large cities in Chicago and some of the smaller cities as well. So,
one more question.
yes.
What I call symbolism, and statues are part of the symbolism. We're going through over here a reevaluation of some of the symbols. There's a slaver in Bristol who's just had his statue pulled down.
I saw that, yeah.
And not long ago, the statue Silent Sam was pulled down in campus,
yeah,
by students and never to be resurrected. Do you think, it always seemed to me very odd that people would say, well, if you pull down a statue, you're denying history, when really all you're doing is saying that pride of place shall not be given to certain people. Do you think that the debate, I mean, you follow the debate is similar here, or do you think that you're ahead of us?
I don't think we're ahead of anybody, honestly. I think that there still is great resistance to this. We have been successful in reducing Silent Sam is gone from the UNC campus, and good riddance to it, and not coming back. But there still is tremendous resistance, and you go to the smaller towns. I don't know the state of it in this country. They haven't completely dealt with it even in South Africa. I think there are still some statues to Cecil Rhodes that are up in South Africa. I know some of them have come down, but there are some that are still up. So I don't know who's ahead in this game or not. There's both lots of work to be done.
I always think that you're ahead of us because you actually recognize the problem, whereas over here we seem to be in constant denial.
Well, maybe, but this country is so divided these days. The question is who recognizes the problem. I'd say that close to 40% of the country doesn't recognize any problem at all. And that's part of it.
Right. Well, we've just had another question pop up in the chat, but sadly, I don't think we're actually going to have time to answer it. Perhaps it's an interesting one and we've got another question that's popped up in the chat as well. But unfortunately, we don't have time, I think, to deal with those. But it leaves for me just to say thank you both to Master Richard Wilmot-Smith for being essentially our moderator this evening. And thank you very much to Master Kenneth Broun for taking us through his experience. I would say to everyone, have a good evening, although I will say to Master Broun, have a good afternoon, for joining us from North Carolina. Thank you all very much. You are free to leave the chat.
Thank you very much for
Thank you very much.
having me. It was a real pleasure and honor. Richard, Krista, Chris, thank you.
It's been great, Ken. Good to see you again.
Good to see you. Hope to see you in person soon.
That
Oh,
would be
I hope so.
Take care now.
Bye-bye.
Bye.